On a blistering hot summer afternoon in 1978, I jumped on my bike and I headed off to Lufkin Pool, one of two public pools that Villa Park owned, and I went there to see my friends. As we arrived, about half the population of Villa Park was there. The pool is packed. A few weeks earlier, the Rolling Stones had released that single, Miss You, and it was blaring through someone's boombox. The pool was great, but that day there were so many people. At the pool, if you were looking for a thrill, your choice was either the high dive platform. Lufkin had a high dive platform, which was really high at one point, or the slide on the side of the pool. Now, as a 10-year-old, and having tried it once or twice, the high dive was not interesting to me at all. But the slide, that was cool. This is a picture of a similar slide. I tried to find a slide of the pool slide that was at Lufkin, but that picture no longer exists, and I'm not surprised if one of the village trustees took it off the web. Whoever designed these slides were probably aware of what design was considered safe, and then they went another 10%, because it was the 70s. Of course, the slide at Lufkin wasn't a straight slide. There was a bump in the middle and then a curve at the end. And why would you secure all four legs to the ground? If you did that, the slide wouldn't bump as you went off of it. It was made out of fiberglass and metal, the same materials that made up my uncle's Corvette. And fiberglass, it was unrelenting in the hot summer sun. It was long before someone thought, let's run a water hose to the top. So if you were the first to go down following a long break, the whole pool heard your legs slowly screech down the fiberglass. The ladder was tight, it was made out of metal, and it went straight up into the air. There was no platform at the top. It had rungs that had grips that would dig into your bare feet. And I always wondered how many other kids thought, am I going to fall backwards and onto the cement? Now, there was one unwritten rule. Once you committed to the slide and started to climb the stairs, you were going down the slide. Every kid in line knew that rule, and the guards enforced it. It was there that I found myself on that hot summer afternoon in 1978. As I reminisce about the challenges of being a 10-year-old, what first came to my memory was the pool slide. It represents possibly my adolescent fear of doing something stupid or getting hurt or worse, being laughed at by not only friends but the wider community. But that memory pales in comparison to other crosses that I bore as a 10-year-old. I was teased as a kid. I probably knew that I wasn't the only one, but at that age, that sort of attention can really sting. Added to that, there were neighbors that sought to make my life miserable. And as I talked to friends growing up, they had similar experiences. Now, those were all things that weighed on my scrawny little shoulders, things that I bore in my own adolescent personal crosses. Little did I know, as I grew older, there would be other crosses to bear. Bigger, heavier, weightier. But there would always be people who walked with me through those times. And my faith would inform me that I was not, and I'm not alone. God hears and helps us to bear whatever cross we are facing. Jesus experienced what it meant to be human, experienced what we go through the trials and tribulations that we find ourselves at. And Jesus walks alongside of us and encourages us to pick up our own cross and to follow him. Eddie Glaude is a Princeton professor, and in his book that's titled Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, which he published in 2020, he quotes James Baldwin, who said, "Hope is invented every day." 3 of James Baldwin's friends, who were also involved working for civil rights, had been tragically murdered. Medgar Evers in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. At that time, the United States was in the midst of the Vietnam War. There were riots through each major city in the U.S., and there were seemingly unsurmountable social and political divides. It was in the midst of those unbelievable challenges that Baldwin wrote those words. Hope is invented every day. Hope which is active and ongoing. Hope that needs to be nurtured, remembered, and reviewed every day. Hope that needs to be shared with one another, especially in challenging and desperate times. Hope which helps us to bear the cross that's before us. The passage that I read today contains the first of 3 instances in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus tells his disciples that he is about to go through great suffering. He is going to be rejected by all authority. He will be killed and he will rise again in 3 days. This revelation to the disciples comes right after the time that Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter had answered him, "You are the Messiah." On the other side of the text that we have today is the text that we use for Transfiguration Sunday, where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a high mountain, where Jesus is transfigured. He is revealed as God's Son, the Beloved. In each of these encounters, Peter, along with the rest of the disciples, are just confused and terrified. They misunderstand most of what Jesus is saying. So we, as followers of Jesus, we're in really good company, right? Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter replies, "You are the Messiah." One biblical commentator stated, Peter was selfish. His focus was on what he might accrue as being a disciple of Jesus when Jesus comes into power. Peter possessed an insight about Jesus' true identity, but he fails to put his own hubris in check. Peter certainly bought into the most popular messianic expectation of that day, the complete religious, political, and military restoration of God's people. That restoration would mean the political overthrow of Roman imperial powers. However, God planned for a different revolution, one in which ultimate victory comes through suffering, turning the standards of the world on its head. Jesus is not the Messiah that he expected, not the Messiah that Peter expected. Imagine what goes through Peter's mind as Jesus tells him that he is going to be ostracized by the religious leaders. He's going to be rejected and scorned and ultimately put to death. Then Jesus says he's going to be raised on the 3rd day. I can imagine Peter saying, "This is crazy talk. What are you saying?" I can also see Peter thinking, now, if that's going to happen to you, what's going to happen to me? We're your followers. Peter takes Jesus aside and it says that he begins to rebuke him. But Jesus turns and gathers the crowd together and his disciples and rebukes Peter. And he says those words, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." This is a strong rebuke. The verb that's used here is the same one that is used earlier in the chapter of Mark, where Jesus rebukes the unclean spirit in a man. In the Gospel of Matthew, it is the same verb that Jesus uses to command the tempter to end this time together. It is a strong rebuke. As Jesus tells what is about to happen to him, Jesus has this eschatological vision. That is, he is seeing the ultimate goal or vision of reconciliation, this destiny of humankind, where Peter is focused on the present, the here and now. And so Jesus rebukes Peter with those powerful words. And then he calls the crowd and the disciples, and he says to them, "If any of you want to be my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." So what does it mean to follow a Messiah who is willing to suffer and die for us? It means that we are called to follow in his footsteps and to keep that vision before us. We experience finite or limited vision in our own life. College students have a goal, a vision of what it means to complete their degree. And along the way, that path is going to certainly have its twists and turns, but as students keep that vision before them, eventually, hopefully, they matriculate and they earn their degree. If you ever had the pleasure of physical therapy, you know there are goals that the physical therapist creates. And you have that in front of you. You need to reach each of those goals in order to finish your physical therapy. If you go hiking, you sail a boat or you fly a plane, you map out your course, you set your destination, and you find markers along the way to make sure you're going in the right direction. So if our goal is on everlasting life, if we set our mind on divine things rather than human things, we walk alongside Jesus and we pick up our own cross and we live our life for the sake of the gospel. It is hope invented every day. We bring hope to those who suffer by suffering alongside them. We recognize the plight of the poor and we walk with them just as Jesus did and Jesus does. I love what Father Greg Boyle said about compassion, that we are to stand in awe of what the poor carry, rather than judge the poor for how they carry their burdens. We should have empathy and we should care for the poor just as Jesus does. We get distracted and confused just as the disciples did. I believe that's one of the reasons that God brings us together in community, to remind each one of us of the way of Jesus, to remind each other that there will be suffering and pain. But as we engage that suffering and pain together, we engage in the hard and difficult work together. We also discover the great joy and blessing that God gives us as our eyes are opened to the vision that Jesus has for us. We believe and we follow a Messiah that has set our minds on divine things, not on human things. So whatever your cross today and tomorrow or in the future, whatever that cross might be, whatever God places on your heart, take it up and follow Jesus on the way. Amen.